So this is part 3 of Chapter 10's lecture on photosynthesis. So we left off on the absorption spectra, talking about the best wavelengths of light that the different pigments can absorb. So we saw that chlorophyll A functions best in the high energy area of about 440 right here, and also again at about 680. And then chlorophyll B functions best around 480, and then again about, maybe 650, 640. So you can see the different wavelengths again, and you can also see that there is no absorption, or essentially none, down in the area where we actually see the reflection of light rather than the absorption, which gives us the color of green that we see in our plants. So when light is absorbed again, we do not see that color, but when it's reflected, because it cannot be absorbed, then we see the color that's reflected. So green is reflected, it's not absorbed, and that's why we see plants as green. One important thing to know about the different accessory pigments, such as chlorophyll B and the carotenoids and the xanthophylls, all of those pigments are not directly involved in the light reactions. What they serve to do instead is they pass on their energy. So they still absorb the energy from the sunlight, but they pass on that energy through electrons over to chlorophyll A, because chlorophyll A is actually the only one involved in the electron transport chain. So the others, while important because they contribute and actually amplify the amount of energy that chlorophyll A can use, they actually are not specifically in the reaction. So looking closely now, we're going to zoom in even more and look at the photosystems in photosynthesis. So we have two different photosystems in the thylakoid membrane. And essentially a photosystem is just a collection of chlorophyll molecules, and they act like light gathering molecules. So we have photosystem 2, and they're actually named in the order that they were found. So photosystem 2 was actually found second, although it's the first photosystem in the light reactions. It absorbs best it's called P680 because it absorbs the 680 nanometer wavelength of red light. Photosystem 1 also, well actually this is an outdated slide here because it's saying they used to believe that photosystem 1 had chlorophyll B in it, but more recently the belief is that photosystem 1 actually has chlorophyll A as well. So photosystem 1 has chlorophyll molecules, and the chlorophyll A in these molecules actually absorbs a slightly different wavelength. It absorbs the 700 nanometer wavelength, which is also red light. And so photosystem 1 is also called the P700 photosystem. We're going to look at why these are called antenna pigments in just a minute. But what we have is a reaction center, and then we have antenna pigments that make up a photosystem. So we'll come back to that. So this is an overview of the electron transport chain in photosynthesis. And we're going to break this down, but I wanted you to take a look at the overall reactions that are occurring. And these are actually just a few of the reactions that are occurring. So this looks rather complicated, but in reality it's far more complicated because we have a lot of reduction oxidation occurring, as electrons are passed along from molecule to molecule until they actually get passed ultimately to the NADP plus molecule, making it an NADPH molecule instead. So right there you see photosystem 2 is the first molecule that we have in our electron transport chain. And again, it's called photosystem 2 because it was found second or discovered second. And then there's photosystem 1. And both of those have a number of pigment molecules of chlorophyll A. This is a picture taken from your textbook, and you can see again the same structures, maybe laid out a little more clearly. So just walking through this quickly, and again we're going to go into more detail, but what happens is first light excites electrons in photosystem 2. Those electrons are then brought to a higher energy state with the light's energy, and from there they are immediately put into this electron transport chain. So they're passed on to this molecule here, which then passes them on to what we call the cytochrome complex, and then that complex passes them on to another molecule through some reactions. And each time they're passed along through this chain, they're losing a little bit of the energy. And that energy is actually what it's being used for is to have hydrogen ions pass through the membrane into the thylakoid space. So one of the things that's going to be occurring as the energy is lost as each reaction occurs, so it's like a falling down of energy that's occurring through this first electron transport chain. So the electrons arrive at photosystem 1 without a lot of energy, but they're still there and they still are available to do some work. But in the meantime, the light is hitting the leaf and the chloroplast all over, and so light is also hitting this photosystem 1. And so while that's happening, we have the electrons that are present in this photosystem become more excited to a higher energy state. And as they do that, then they're able to go into the second electron transport chain, where ferredoxin is the intermediate molecule that passes them on then with the help of this enzyme, NADP reductase, to add them to NADPH. That NADPH, as you can see, this reductase molecule is on the outside of this plasma membrane, which means it's in the stroma of the chloroplast. So this NADPH is already, as it's being made, it is already sitting in the stroma, ready to be passed and used by the Calvin cycle, which is going to occur inside the stroma as well. Another part of this process that I want to point out now has to do with the production of ATP. So what's happening at this beginning stage right here, as light is exciting the electrons that are present in these, actually what is part of this is called the reaction center of the photosystem. Within the reaction center we have two or a pair of special chlorophyll A molecules that are electron acceptors as well. And so they hold on to electrons so that when light excites and is absorbed by the different pigments of chlorophyll A, that energy is passed on to these electrons that are located on these chlorophyll A molecules. And as they become excited, they get passed on to another molecule again. And so what happens then is that these chlorophyll A molecules are missing electrons. And so they have a deficit here that has to be filled somehow. And the way that gets filled is by stealing a couple electrons from water, and in particular from the hydrogen that is part of H2O. So this driving reaction, this lack of electrons here, pulls the water molecules' electrons into the photosystem. And what happens is water gets split, which is why we have water as one of our reactants in photosynthesis. And what we end up with, as water is split, we end up with hydrogen ions that have given up their electrons. So we have our two hydrogen ions. And we end up with a single oxygen molecule that's floating around. And what it will do is quickly find another oxygen molecule to combine and make a double bonded oxygen gas molecule, which will then diffuse out through the thylakoid membrane, then out through the chloroplast, and then out through the leaf. And this is how we produce oxygen as a product in photosynthesis. But we still have these hydrogen protons that are floating around inside the thylakoid space. So this is again our thylakoid membrane. Inside we have this empty space. And what is important about this space is that it becomes a place where hydrogen protons start to gather. So we have hydrogen protons entering through the cascading and falling down of the electrons as they pass down the chain. That energy is actually driving protons into this thylakoid space. And then we have the protons that are being produced by the splitting of water. So we end up with a gradient, a high concentration of hydrogen protons within the thylakoid space. So through diffusion, we're able then to have those hydrogen ions pass through ATP synthase, which is a transport protein in the thylakoid membrane. And as it passes through, there is energy that actually is generated in that process, and that process allows the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP. So we end up with ATP being produced, again, outside of the thylakoid membrane in the stroma of the chloroplast. And that ATP is now available to help make the Calvin cycle run. So that, in a nutshell, are the light reactions of photosynthesis. So this is just a close-up showing that same idea. And what I'd like you to see in this picture in particular are the different parts of a photosystem. So we have this central part that's called the reaction center, and that's where the electrons actually become excited and move up into an electron transport chain. And then we have other molecules on the outside, which are called the light harvesting molecules. So this part outside here acts as an antenna. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. An light antenna to absorb the light photons that are being passed into this photosystem. So in writing here, you can see some of the things you should know about photosystems. Again, that they're made up of these two areas, light harvesting complexes and the reaction center complex. And the reaction center complex has a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules, and it has the primary electron acceptor located here for those excited electrons from the light energy. And then surrounding our reaction center, we have the light harvesting complex, which acts as an as an antenna for the reaction center complex.